People always have the misconception as like, oh, we don't practice our business as a family. We're high performance, like sports teams, like athletes. I'm like, look, there's pros and cons to both. But what I've seen at the end of the day is in a family run business who treats people like family, they generally have high employee experience. And if you have a high degree of employee experience, like a variable that I generally measure in like people analytics, you're going to have a successful business. You see increased customer satisfaction, profitability, earnings per share, and growth. Fact.
Hello, everyone. This is The Next Moves, and it's a series of interviews done with people who have built incredible companies and awesome careers. I'm doing it for the simple reason that there are so many moments where I'm sitting in meetings in my job as a recruiter, talking with a CEO or a founder or a member of their team, and they're talking about the choices that they've had in front of them and how they considered them. And then as they made them, the impact and what happened. And I'm just thinking to myself, this is so valuable for people because we all get stuck. And hearing how people plan their next move and the move after that, it can help us make better decisions. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes it feels like people make very logical, calculated decisions. And all the other times it feels like they flip a coin. And I think we can learn from both those scenarios and the outcomes they got. So without any further delay, let's talk to my next guest. My guest today is someone who I find super interesting. His name is Jimmy Tristovski. And Jimmy is interesting because he is a data-driven HR and people leader. And a lot of people say they're data-driven, but Jimmy is going very deep into this. And he's helped run fast growth tech company HR and people functions. And he does it in a very disciplined and effective way. And I look at him as an architect behind the cultures that we have in some of the best companies in Toronto and across Canada. So you're going to hear about how this former Windsor kid, he dreamed of engineering and he tried his hand at MMA, and then he found his calling in HR and leadership. And using this design thinking and hard numbers, he was able to show HR as a profit lever and not a cost center. And I'm going to dig into his playbook for building, talent systems that drive that growth, the way that he attacks problems that he uncovers inside of organizations and how he prioritizes them, and the tough lessons that he's learned when culture starts cracking, and why data really needs to be looked at as a secondary source alongside your gut feel, because they can play off each other. And if they're working together, you get a much better outcome. So this is for anyone who stared at this empty talent strategy and tried to figure out, how do I build this effectively? And can I scale this organization without breaking it? And he's done it more than once. So without further ado, here's my guest, Jimmy.
Thanks. Happy to be here. By the way, that was a fantastic intro.
I like to open with a question, and then we end with the same question, which is, if you had to boil everything down to one principle that drives a successful people strategy, what would it be?
The way that I look at it, when you jump into these types of opportunities, or if you're in this profession, is that employees are customers and work is a product, full stop. That's how I look at it. Okay. Whereas classical HR teams don't do that. And we'll get into that in a bit. We need to essentially optimize our quote unquote product, again, which is, our work, in order to provide the value for our customers, if that makes sense, which is our employees. So we need to operate similarly how like a product or an engineering team would operate, right? And this requires a really big change in mentality and cultures and just the general skill set for like our practitioners. So like going back into, like I mentioned, like people look at, and a lot of businesses still do, and a lot of HR professionals or people professionals still look at themselves in this way, where is like HR is a classical like procurement or like an admin function that's built to be a servant, right? And it's like structured in a classical way as an input to production. Whereas some new age departments, some companies do this pretty well, and some practitioners that I know, they're like a value added line of business, right? Mm-hmm. So the leadership is valued as a partner with significant line of like business that creates economic value, essentially, even if it's predominantly savings. So managers in these departments have to be proficient with, like how you mentioned in my intro, like people-centric design thinking, which is essentially bringing like innovative solutions to life by understanding how employees, which is again our customers, think, feel, and behave, right? Whereas like classical HR does not really follow that path, and it's very much dedicated to like that procurement and administrative mindset. So in order to be relevant and competitive, as an industry leading organization, those teams have to adapt. And there's still a need for obviously the classical elements in HR, but they're generally smaller functions, in my opinion, that need to do that. So
for people to know where you've come from, like walk me through born, raised, school, sports, decisions, like how you're wired,
sure,
and where you come from.
So like you mentioned, grew up in Windsor, so Windsor boy. And I think you were also raised in Windsor.
Hamilton boy, but went to Teachers College in Windsor.
That's right. That's what it was. So you know the area. My dad immigrated to the country in like the 70s. So like he was in his late 20s. A lot of influence comes from my dad. So you hear me sometimes reference him a couple of times. But just like what he accomplished in his life is like, it's not like Arnold Schwarzenegger level, where he went through all these different things, but it's pretty epic, right? Like he played professional soccer in Germany. He was like a mechanical engineer. He's a marathon swimmer. He still holds the record in Lake Erie for the longest marathon swim, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Worked for Ford for such a long time, was a musician, got us all into music when we were young age. We had a family band growing up. So he was like a loving disciplinary. That's what I call him. Like, he was just beastly in nature. So I think that rubbed off on us. So like me, my brother, and my sister, we were always very like motivated. I think we had a good like role model. Shout out to my mom too. She was also a good role model in a different way. But a lot of that energy, was, driven from parents having a good life growing up. But early on, I always liked tinkering, problem solving. I gravitated more towards math and science. At a young age. I know I was joking about like being the chess savant, but like I played a lot of chess too when I was young. I did a lot of mentorship and charity for like the Great Canadian Chess Challenge growing up. So like my brain was always wired more towards that. Was always in cars, was always in athletics, just again, because of my dad, my brother. I just kind of gravitated that way. So when it came to high school, all my subjects were mathematics, right? So it was like calculus, it was physics, enriched chemistry, biology, computer science. I did all of that, right? My mindset was I was going to go into engineering. I was going to do something that was similar to my dad's like profession or my brother's, because he's quite a bit older than me. And as I was going into university, things were changing. The recession back in like 07, 08. Might be dating myself now, but
We're all old.
But, yeah, I'm just getting there. And I wasn't sure if there was going to be opportunity for me in like automotive sector or in engineering. And then the more I thought of it being work, I wasn't sure how much I liked that. Right. So, but again, I had this part of my brain that's always just like mathematical, analytical, looking at like problems, trying to understand them from the root cause, solving it that way. Thing in the back of my brain that was like a leadership seed that was just trying to grow. And I think I always saw that in athletics, right? So it doesn't matter what sport I was playing. I know you mentioned MMA, but a big part of my life was also like soccer, basketball. I played most sports at school, right? Did the individual sports as well, like swimming, tennis, and MMA. But when it came down to the team sports, I just naturally gravitated towards like the on-field general, right? That type of persona. The first time I got into like recruitment and exposed to that was actually in university. It was before I actually started it. And there was this organization called Guatemala Hope, and they're a non-for-profit. They're building houses in Guatemala, like in impoverished areas, particularly. And their challenge was actually getting volunteers to go over there because at the time in the areas where they were building, there was a high crime rate. So a lot of the volunteers would go there and, the building materials that were shipped and all that sometimes would be compromised. So it was trying to actually get talent, to join them. So that was when I was first exposed to it. But because they were a small non-for-profit, like I had an opportunity to play like a leadership type of role, right? Because it was very small. They just needed who they could. And I really liked that. So going into going into the main workforce, I'm like, okay, I have a couple niches here. One of them is a technical mindset, but I love the idea of leadership and I love the idea of impacting businesses from a people perspective. So how can I do that? So HR and people was the obvious route. But everywhere where I interviewed and places I saw that like most businesses looked at HR as like pencil pushing assholes. And they're just like, yeah, this is not really a business optimizing function. I'm like, how do we change that? Yeah. Right. And I'm sure you've been exposed to probably that sentiment too, like, like a decade ago or more. But my whole niche was like, how can we make it more scientific? And how can we make it a business optimizer? So I started doing that throughout my career.
So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4 jobs sure. that you take. The first one that you take is what?
Well, first one I took, and some people might have gone down this route. I was actually involved in like a pyramid scheme that I didn't know was.
Were you at the top or at the bottom?
I was at the bottom. I was way
very different from the bottom, from what I hear.
It's kind of hilarious now looking back on it, but like it exposed me to like Toronto because I wanted to move here. That was the job, and I started to see red flags. It was like within 2 weeks, I'm like, okay, this is clearly not an actual job, I guess. But it was like red flags, like, oh, we pay you like monthly at the end of the month. You got to generate like 150 leads for this and that. I'm like, I thought this is supposed to be like a little bit more consulting. I'm like, what's going on? This is like back end sales. Anyway, after that job, I got into like a boutique agency, right? Because I had a bit of that experience in the past. Obviously, had a lot of like sales experience. I worked at like Radio Shack, which is now the source, yep. Right? Like by Bell for like 6.5 years. So I had experience as assistant manager. I was like doing a lot of sales, wireless devices, packages, But after that, got into the boutique agency, gave me good exposure to Toronto like market and a lot of the different partners that we worked with, industries. And this was also at like the start of the startup boom, which is where I started to meet a lot of contacts. And you also know, like agency side, you start to meet tons of people, right?
You do.
And then, from there I went to Career Builder. I wanted something a little bit more like engaging, a bit more advanced with more responsibility. You're familiar with Career Builder.
Absolutely. They right? were one of the top brands in that space.
Yeah, 100%. And they're doing some really great stuff with like software as a service back then. So it was like a mix of like running a 360 desk, but also consulting at the same time. So it's like you find your clients, but you're also, like helping engage them. And I had great opportunities to work with like companies from Vancouver, Chicago, New York.
What I'm curious about is like you're doing this work in Career Builder.
Mm-hmm.
You get that because you're doing like to land that role, you're coming out of recruitment in an agency. And how do you actually dovetail that or move it into a role as a consultant? And what at that point was one of the best HR talent tech companies around. How do you make that move?
Great question. So I think it was the way I positioned myself, and regardless of coming from an agency, I think a lot of people have, people have a lot of misconceptions of agencies and like the work required to do that, especially if you're coming from a small one and what's required to build that type of business. So I think they really appreciated the book of business that I was able to build. They knew that I understood not just this small niche of recruiting, but like how the world works, how business operates, right? Like budgeting, forecasting, appealing to the customers that you're actually working with. How do you service them afterwards? How do you solve their problems? And I think they just saw me more as a problem solver with a niche in a scientific field, or at least a scientific mindset.
So you end up then, like, you've worked with some very well-known brands like theScore.
Mm-hmm.
I remember theScore when it was starting up and scaling up. I know Top Hat quite well from common people, like an ed tech company, every time back to theScore as well in its later form.
Yeah.
And a series of these well-known organizations, including PolicyMe. So
Mm-hmm.
you've scaled teams now in these companies from a few dozen to over 1,000 employees. So
Yeah.
I have to ask, like, you're coming in, how well defined is the company's ask and of you when you're joining? Like, how well defined is it when you join these companies?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the organization. And yeah, you named some big names there. There are also companies that you'd remember, like that I worked with, like in a consultative capacity, like Wishabi, which is now Flip.
Yep.
So back in the day, Hyper Wallet, which got purchased by PayPal, GM, like big names, small names. But I would say it really depends. And to your point, a lot of people they don't know what they want. It's true for when they're looking for consultants, and it's also true for when they're looking for employees. But they're a bit more cautious and hesitant when they're looking for full-time employees because they don't want to make a mistake. But generally speaking, I would say 80% of the companies, it's not well structured with what they want. And I don't think they see the potential of what it can become and how important these people functions are to overall success. Now, I use the score, and especially like early days score, as an example quite often because it's one of Canada's unicorn, like tech companies that had a massive exit. But they really knew what they want. They had an amazing leadership team, and at least they had the structure of how they wanted it to operate in a sense, and more driven by goals and a mission, like a clear vision of what needed to be done, but also the trust and the autonomy to, hey, we hired you for a specific reason. We know your track record. We know your ability to collaborate with teams cross-functionally, solve problems. Come in and help us do this so we can become this massive billion-dollar, company from a humble startup. So I use them as an example of one of the companies that did know, and even with them, they didn't know everything, but they had amazing leaders who would ask the right questions and allow you to help them scale truly. And they saw you as a partner, and that's one of the key ones. It's like, hey, this is a partner who's a business optimizer, not a cost center.
Let's talk about that because they knew what they wanted. But what was that business when you joined? Like, what was it? Like, I know, but I'd like you to share, like, what was the industry and what space did it start in and what did it evolve into over time?
So there's sports media and betting company now, right? So you go on your phone, you can download the app. It's a media app. It gives you all the scores, news, updates. There's chat channels. It became like Canada's sweetheart in the sports area. It evolved into a sports betting platform, similar to what people might hear, the bigger names like DraftKings, FanDuel, et cetera, and then an iCasino. So all of those combined. Prior to that, though, it was a television network. Now, me and you, because we're a bit more dated, quote unquote, we remember experienced. Let's say that. That's a good word. We remember the television network days, right, where they were like a Sportsnet or one of them. So they had sold their entity, the media entity, off to Rogers, right? And they were left over with the digital assets, though. Like Rogers didn't acquire those. So they basically built the first free phone app that I had, which was on a BlackBerry. And I remember seeing it back then and being like, oh, this would be a cool kind of company to work for. I'm like, what are they doing? This was years before I had the opportunity to work with them. But then I worked with them as a third party when I want to say they're like 100 people, right? Like 110 people, helping scale the engineering side more particularly, like building that side and the product side.
There's an idea of growth and there's an idea of doing it properly. And it sounds like, according to you, they did some things well. Give me the 1, 2, 3 that they did well as they were scaling.
So we started as a more of a humble team. It was around like 6 people. I think that's the number. My leader, Sally Farrell, big shout out to her. She was an encyclopedia of like HR knowledge. It was just like, hey, what's this? Boom. It's like she knew all that. So it helped that you had someone who was like a knowledge master in that area, and then combined with like critical thinkers, problem solvers. It was awesome. On top of that, she and the founders, it wasn't just her, it was the founders, the Levy family, who, amazing leaders. Love that family. They did a lot for me. They had the mindset of like, you got to build an amazing culture, and culture is everything. And if you look at some of the like most successful companies, like when you really look at it and try and sit down and think, you can name a lot of the big organizations like the Googles and so on and so forth. But if you look at other companies now, like successful companies that's where a startup and the scale up, they have a common ingredient, and it's culture, a wicked culture.
Well, it also sounds like there's a prioritization at the highest level for culture, which is like they're telling you to build this, as opposed to you saying we need to build this. They're pushing you as opposed to you pulling them.
Correct. And the thing though was like my first time at theScore was the first time that I would say I was like so refreshed and saying like, oh wow, I'm like, this is what coming into a place looks like that is already well established with a culture.
Yeah.
Right. Their challenge will now be scaling that culture as it grows. Right. Because again, 175 people, I knew every single employee's name, like what they did, like by memory, right? And we had that camaraderie, we had that collaboration. Everybody was involved. The C-suite didn't have like egos; they weren't assholes, right? Like I was saying earlier, is like they treated you like family. And I think it was because the nature was they were a family that started it. And some people always have the misconception as like, oh, we don't practice our business as a family. We're high performance, like sports teams, like athletes. I'm like, look, there's pros and cons to both. But what I've seen at the end of the day is in a family run business who treats people like family, they generally have high employee experience, right? If they're doing it right way, right? And they're extending that outward. And if you have a like high degree of employee experience, like a variable that I generally measure in like people analytics, you're going to have a successful business. You see increased customer satisfaction, profitability, earnings per share, and growth. Fact, right? So I think they did it the right way. And to your point, all the way from the top to down, same mindset, excitement, motivation, passion from everybody. And it was very refreshing coming into that. So now it's like, okay, we're 175. How do we maintain that at 1,000?
Yeah. You're counter to the popular narrative, like you said, of we're not a family, we're a team.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that you did. And then you backed it up with what you will see inside of these organizations. So my question within that, how do you overlay people analytics in each of these roles? And let's get a 30-second definition for it.
How I look at it, how others might define it might be different. And I want to start with the purpose of it. And the purpose of it is to drive insights to maximize that EX variable. And that's that like employee experience variable, which has a whole ton of other layers underneath it. But how I would define it, it's like deeply like data-driven, goal-focused method of like studying people, processes, functions, challenges, and like opportunities at work, so that you can like elevate these processes and systems to achieve that business success through what I just mentioned, which was like the EX, like driving insights to maximize EX. So,
well, I want you to give me a very clear example of the practice and implementation of it at any of these companies.
Yes. So first thing I'll usually do when I enter an organization, I want to understand their current state. Okay, so what I do for that, I use two types of models. So I use, because generally speaking, I've always managed or been the head of talent functions.
Yeah.
Yes, I've done obviously people and culture, HR, as you've seen in other jobs, but there's like a model which is called like a maturity model, right? And similar to like if there's any engineers or other people listening, like on the technical side, that's like, what's the maturity model? It'd be similar to like how AWS has a maturity model to like implement their like systems there. Similar type of method for talent, right? There's a maturity model with a lot of different functions attached to it, which is like sourcing, recruiting,
Yep.
employment branding, recruiting culture, compliance, blah 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 blah. Right? So like where are you on a scale of like 1 to 5, right? Being like 1 is like super ad hoc, reactive, and 5 is being fully optimized. And by doing a deep dive and understanding where you are, that will help you understand, okay, like where are we currently? What are we missing? What are some of the challenges? What do we need to put in place to address those challenges to reach our business goals? Because you got to tie them to the business goals at the end of the day. Same thing on the data side. So when we're talking about like people analytics specifically, I gave that example first for like listeners who might not be as technical.
Yep.
But there's also a class, like more of a classical like data maturity model that I also use, right? And again, following that same format, it's like on a scale of like 1 to 5, where are you? Where 1 is like ad hoc, very initial, data is used like sporadically without consistent process.
It
Or
exists in silos.
it's in silos. Yeah. It's completely unmanaged. You're heavily reliant on spreadsheets, blah, blah. How do you get to the area which is fully optimized and transformational, which is like your data is embedded into the culture, right? And you're driving innovation and like continuous improvement because of, the maturity that you're at. So that's more like, think like real-time analytics, automated insights. You're using AI and machine learning capabilities. They're much more mature. You have a culture of experimentation. You're A/B testing. You're proactive. It's a completely different level.
So give me an example of those data points that you're collecting. If we standardize our processes, like what are the actual measurements that you give when you're at a more up that maturity model curve?
I'm not going to go into the maturity model because it would probably take like a podcast to just talk about the maturity model.
Part two.
Yeah, we can do something like that. But in terms of like some metrics that you would start off with, like let's say we're at a startup, founders haven't even heard of people analytics, and like, oh, what is this? Like, how can we benefit from this? It would be starting as something as simple as in the recruiting function, right?
Really time to fill.
Yes, that's an element of it for sure. And then as you start to get more advanced, it's like, well, we'll dial it back. Time to fill, source of hire, et cetera, as you know. You get a little bit more advanced, you can then start to calculate cost per hire, right? How much does this cost? And then you can tell a better story of why, if we're taking 50 days to hire this role instead of 20, it's costing you a lot more.
I have a friend who says what he's good at is eating payroll. And what are your key skills? Well, I eat payroll really well. But it's true. When you first start, you're losing money. I mean, in our business, you look at it as your first year as an investment in an individual. You recover some or all of that year 2. And then after that, people can become fully economically profitable. But you're looking at what are the key inputs into that. So it's interesting. Do you see that thinking when you step into companies?
No. I haven't seen it now. Like, shout out to PolicyMe. Like we can get to that stuff later, but they have the right mindset and vision.
At PolicyMe?
Yeah, excellent. Which is great. I like came in and again, I'm digressing a bit, but like the culture is amazing already. Good culture of documentation, good systems in place.
Excellent.
Open mindset, good collaboration, all this. But they appreciate what I'm able to bring to the table in terms of that, like people analytics structure. And I think they're already seeing it. But in the past, like you can start as simple as what I might be doing now because we're a bit earlier in the journey. to what we had at theScore at one point, which is what we were basically talking about, right? You have all these managed dashboards, which you're a big partner with even finance, right? You're forecasting headcount, you're calculating all these costs, you're calculating the salaries, you have a employee in, employee out type of measurement. You are measuring capacity. That was one thing we did. So if you want a specific example, it's and on the recruitment front, right? A big challenge for companies is always like, why are you hiring so many people, right? And it's like, okay, if you don't have people analytics or data to show, then you're going to have a tough time pitching why. But when you have something that's fully mature, you can show, okay, for each one of these departments, here's the rough time to hire. We know X amount of days for this type of position. Here's what the funnel looks like. You need, example, 100 interviews at the recruiter level to get down to one person signing, right? Because you're following this funnel and trying to see the conversion at each funnel, and then you're trying to optimize that.
Yes, and there's a lot of optimization effort before a headcount is pulled and before a headcount's given, right? Let's optimize the conversion at the middle of the funnel so you have more people.
Yes.
Yeah, I get it.
Exactly. So you know that part. But then the question is, okay, it's like, okay, then they finally see that. They're like, oh, Jimmy or Joe is on to something, right? We got to hire 50 people and the average time to fill is X, but the average top of funnel metric for how many people we need is averaging at 100 interviews per role. 100 interviews times 50 is, Joe, quick math.
It's 5,000.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. 5,000. That's a lot of man and woman power, to do that, right? It's
agents. We need agents out there, AI agents.
I know. No, we'll get to that too. But that's a big story to tell. So then it's like, okay, they need recruiters, but how many? Here's this capacity model, Mr. or Mrs. Executive. This is how much time recruiters spend on each task on average. We have it in a model that we've built. We were able to plug in these jobs, right? They're organized by department. And it's an automated calculation that says Joe has X amount of time to take on an additional job. If anything is over, so if he goes in the red in this tool that we built in-house, that means Joe no longer has time. So if you're assigning him a role, we will not be able to fill it at the expected time to hire, right? It will now take double or triple the time.
Yeah.
Do you want to risk having a product leader, designer, engineer, salesperson, finance person delayed 90 days?
No, Jimmy, I don't.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, great. So I'm going to hire another recruiter, or I'm going to do, and the same goes for, the people and culture side or employment brand, so on and so forth, right? And you can get very advanced with these metrics. And that was my whole point of kind of telling that story is like, where are you in this journey? What's important and how is it going to relate to business goals? Like we weren't just doing those things for vanity, right?
So I have a question for you then, because this ties to outcomes that your founders are thinking about all the time. Mm-hmm. And you said this to me, and I want you to explain it. And some founders think they just need superstars on their team. And that's an oversimplification.
Very much so, an oversimplification. I usually give an analogy for this. So hopefully some people are athletes. If they're not, that's okay. I think a lot of people still know it. So 2004 NBA championship was between Detroit Pistons, my team, and the LA Lakers. Okay. And even people who don't follow basketball, they know the names Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, Karl Malone. Again, depends on what age group you are. But they were a team of all-stars. Every single one of them, including their bench players, were on the all-star team that year. The Detroit Pistons were not all-stars. They were, if I drop some of these names, people are going to be like, who? Like Ben Wallace, Chauncey Billups, Rip Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince, et cetera, right? None of them. They had a really good coach, a really good leader, but they were role players. And the way the Pistons built out their team that year, or over, a couple of years, was to fill certain gaps where they had challenges in. Whereas the mindset of the Lakers was, we're just going to get the best people who cost the most money because they were all-stars. Yeah, great. But, they skewed heavily towards offensive, side of, what all-star looked like for basketball. Whereas Ben Wallace was rebounding, defense, blocking. Nobody could touch him. Rip Hamilton ran the floor like nobody else, would always create openings. You had people who were three-point shooters. You had good leaders. Point being, the Pistons destroyed them, right? It was a sweep. And that goes back to how you build teams too, is what I say. It's like, if you just look for all-stars, right, egos can come into play. It's like everybody, too many cooks and too many chefs in the kitchen, as they say, right? It's you wanna hire based off of competency, and you need to understand where your gaps are in competencies. So if I have a particular gap, among a team, when I hire my next role or when I budget for the next role, so I want to solve for that challenge.
Given that we're building these teams constantly at Clarity, like we're building these leadership teams, and we've historically operated mostly in finance, and now we are aggressively being pulled into by our clients into HR, people, talent, and operations, right? And when you look at that, when I say operations is broad depending on what kind of company you're in.
Yeah.
My question is, the HR and people function rolling up to the CFO or COO versus the CEO. Does that affect your view, just like whether that organization values it or not? Or does it not? Does it actually just become, you need greater context around everything?
No, that's a really good question. I would say one factor depends on how united that C-suite is. Because I've seen in the past for companies I've consulted for, and even sometimes depends on some of the places that I've been like full time, where there's not always generally a unity behind the direction and the vision. And if one person has more of the decision-making authority at the end of the day, and they don't value the people function, you're going to have a tougher sell. The biggest mistake that the HR practitioners and like people departments have is they can't communicate how our function optimizes the business and essentially creates more profitability, more growth, more opportunity.
No, I think it's an excellent answer. And I think I want to actually say this has been an amazing conversation. It felt easy, right? We just ripped through things.
Good.
I always want to make sure that people know, they can find you on LinkedIn and they can connect with you. And
LinkedIn's the best spot to see everything that I'm doing professionally.
Okay.
That's where I encourage people to go and follow me. And obviously the PolicyMe page now that we're going to take this company on a rocket ship now.
To the moon.
To the moon. That's the plan.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. Okay.
Yeah. Appreciate it, Joe.